Statistics, South Africa recently, I think 2 weeks ago, released statistics of migration from South Africa to other countries. The core focus of that report was more on white migration since 1994 up until quite recently, 2025. And the report was more about the numbers. And that's what drew a lot of media. A lot of media was so obsessed with the number of white people that are leaving. And to a certain extent, when one listened at analysts and pundits, it emerged that the feeling was that South Africa needed to have white people to be validated as a country. That when white people leave, there seemed to be something that goes missing, or there's a limp that South Africa loses and it cannot be whole without white people, which I think is a very bad premise, which is a very bad space to start beginning to imagining an African country. Because the same feeling can be if you go to Norway, to Sweden, to Finland, to the countries that are quite European. European isn't even called Europe. I see Europe. I'm sure if at any given time they had a population of like 1 million or 500,000 black people, if they leave, I doubt that it's going to raise alarm bells, to ring alarm bells, whereby people will feel this is going to become less of a country because black people left for wherever they went to or for whatever reason they left. So the interest that peaked around that time for me was worrying, because it somehow spoke to a fear amongst some black people that the departure of white people seemed to say something negative about the country, and it might actually be saying something positive. However, I understood that the premise for many was, there are a lot of black people post-94 who use white people to validate themselves, those who aspire to be white. They take their kids to white schools, they speak English with their kids, they speak English in church. They even, English for them is like the language that they think they are more comfortable using, to the point that they've forgotten their own languages, they've forgotten their own totems, they've forgotten everything about their blackness. They're more focused on whiteness. So they also move from where they stay to go and stay with white people, which is fine. It's fine to try and upgrade where you stay, but it's not fine when you are chasing after white people. When you go and live in a suburb and the white people leave, you go and chase them to the next suburb. They leave and then you go and chase them, as if you need white people in your life to feel whole. Without white people, you are missing a limb. But the feeling I sensed was that it was coming from those that have always used white people to validate their blackness, or those that aspire to be white. Like the example that I always had is now living, what am I going to look like? What's the point of trying to look like something that is not going to be here in 2, 3, 4 years' time? However, my engagement with this conversation, with the StatsSA conversation, is really about why white people live. Why are white people leaving South Africa for other areas? Where we need to start is why white people came. Because you can't look at why somebody's leaving without looking at why somebody came in the first place. Because when you talk the language of immigration, you always talk about the pull and the push. For someone to leave their place of domicile and go and seek pastures somewhere else is because of a push. The nomadic nature of African people was because of a pull and a push. You have livestock and you have run out of pasture, you leave, go and find a place where you can pasture, or you're living in an area, you're not getting the right rains, and you leave, you go and find a place where you can get the right rains because you are farming, you want to harvest. So there's always been a push, there's always been a pull. So people have always been moving around. It's not a new thing. Europeans, when they came to Africa, they came to Africa because they were attracted by the resources, the gold, the diamond, the platinum, the different kinds of resources. Even the wealth that was built by the early white people like John Road was built on the back of minerals. The agricultural enterprise was something they ventured into after 1913 Native Land Act in South Africa specifically, because now they wanted land to farm. But before that, it was mining in the Rand meaning what you call Joburg right now. And the John Road's route from down there everywhere else, past Kimberley, was more about resources, about minerals. So the other part of farming came later. So when you farm land and you don't enrich it, you don't put manure, you don't use the organic ways of sustaining it, as after some time it's not going to produce anything for you. Now that becomes obsolete for you, you cannot be able to farm. And if your purpose for coming here was to farm, you are most likely to want to leave here and go to another country where you can be able to pursue farming, because whatever you came for is no longer here. South Africa was once a gold leader, a leader in gold since the 1890s, since the 20th century, up until quite recently, I think 10, 15, 20 years ago. Now it has been overtaken by other countries. Now, it also explains why the people who came here for the gold are going to leave to go to other areas. But an interesting thing was the StatsSA report is about 2024-25, but you go back to 1994. There's been more than a million white people living, but they still constitute a sizable number, like 6% of the population, or 5%, 6%, and they still constitute the group that has most of the wealth. The richest group in South Africa is white people. Most of the land is owned by white people. And after 94, there are those that left only to return later. There was something called the homecoming revolution. They'll leave, go, think they'll be comfortable in Australia or New Zealand or Britain, but only to return, because usually when white people leave South Africa, they go to another country with white people. They usually go to majority white people countries, but usually they love the settler colonies of New Zealand, of Australia. You don't hear much about the white person leaving South Africa saying, I'm going to Colombia, or I'm going to Mexico, or I'm going to Egypt, or I'm going to United Arab Emirates. So you'll hear these reasons that, we're leaving South Africa because of the crime rate, and you live, but they don't go to countries that pose zero. They don't go to Sweden. They don't live here and say, no, I'm going to Norway, I'm going to Finland, I'm going to Sweden. They live here and go to countries that have their own crime problems, to say at the end of the day, they don't live because of the crime situation. They live because some of them, the loss of the country, the minimum wage regime means you cannot hire somebody to do your garden and still pay them as you please, or hire somebody to take care of your house and still pay them as you please. There are laws now. This apartheid laws of paying black people like slaves are no longer there, so they cannot afford to continue hiring black people. So they go to a country where there'll always be somebody they can oppress. They'll go to New Zealand because they live there, Maori, the native New Zealand people. They'll go there and then they can get the Maori because they are, some of them fell through the cracks, they're poor, and then they can continue having people that they can hire because some of these countries don't have a minimum wage regime. They'll go to New Zealand because they'll get the Aboriginals. They'll go to Britain because they'll get those Africans that are leaving their countries, Sudan, Nigeria, and the northern African countries, to go to Europe. They might find them that they can be able to have them work for them and exploit them and have their own slaves. So some people leave because they are used to having slaves, and when time comes they can't have slaves, they're going to leave for a country where they can keep the slaves or where they can have slaves. So the statistics that came recently, I looked back to 1994. I lived in Johannesburg around the time when Nelson Mandela was about to come into power. There was migration, serious migration of white people, because they just couldn't stomach being ruled by a black person. They've been living under South Africa, under part of South Africa, whereby white people governed, ruled over black people. They were killing black people. They were imprisoning them. They were denying them rights. They were arresting them for no reason. They were bombing them. They were comfortable living in that South Africa. But when it was so obvious that Nelson Mandela was going to come into power, they just couldn't stomach that. They couldn't stomach living in a country where the president was going to be somebody who advocates for peace, who advocates for equality, who advocates for human rights. They were comfortable living in a country without human rights. That's why even when they leave now, they go to countries that have a very dodgy human rights record. Britain has a dodgy human rights record. Australia has a dodgy human rights record because it doesn't even want to take immigrants. It takes white immigrants. And now, quite recently, in the United States, said they're going to take Afrikaners, but they're not going to take Afrikaner whites. White Afrikaners, they're not going to take everyone else. They put a stop to immigration, but they've opened immigration for white Afrikaners. So they will go to those countries that perpetuate the stereotype they have about black people, because a majority, unfortunately, of white people still have the stereotype. They believe they're superior. They believe they were created to rule over black and brown people. that they cannot live in an environment whereby they can. In Zimbabwe, when they were saying Mugabe was taking their farm, Mugabe was not taking anybody's farm. He was just asking for them to share what they've been sitting on for ages. But when they couldn't agree to sharing, as per Lancaster Agreement, Britain couldn't allocate the money to reform land, and Mugabe decided that, look, we are going to share this thing. They started living, they started crying wolf, because they like the situation where they've got a lot of people under their control. So the statistics South African numbers that showed white people are living, I said to someone else, look, this should be relief, because the living of white people, it also an erosion of a conspiracy or a belief that white people are superior, that South Africa cannot move without white people. They need to stand back wherever they are and look at the country prospering, flourishing, for them to start realizing that maybe some of them were just here causing problems for us. They were making government pass laws like affirmative action, black economic empowerment, fraud-based black. You pass laws to address the fact that black people were denied, because there are white people who are still here, who are still denying. But when you don't have white people, when white people have left, those that are racist, you don't need to pass laws. You can just really continue with white people who understand, because South Africa had white people who understood, who fought against apartheid in different parts, through the arts, through sports, through other platforms, through politics. And they don't have a problem with a redress, with racial redress. But then some have got the problem. They're hiding in political parties, Solidarity, NGOs, they call them NGOs, Solidarity, AfriForum, Democratic Alliance, and then they've got their own black lackeys who believe that it's fine for white people to continue dominating, because they've grown used to that stereotype, to that belief that black people were born to be inferior, because they also feel they are inferior by virtue of whatever book. They've got holy books that tell them that they should be inferior. So I think the departure of this number of white people should not mean South Africa is less of a country. It just should mean it's more of a country, because a time will come when we no longer need this laws to redress race, when we are left with white people who understand that South Africa needs a redress, and when those that are racist have gone outside, maybe they'll find somebody to oppress, maybe they might not find, maybe they'll sneak back in quietly. But over and above, South Africa doesn't need white validation to be a country. It doesn't need white validation to be a human rights, a country, a nation rooted in human rights. Someone said some time ago that the mistake that was made by racist white people in 1994, that they never left. That if they left, South Africa would have been far a better country. So yeah, like and subscribe to ASAP, a South African Perspective, and let's make the circle bigger.